Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to oped.tv. This is the first of a three-part series of interviews with the extraordinary Diane Ravitch. Ms. Ravitch is an historian, lecturer, essayist, and former college professor who has spent 5 decades, count them, analyzing public education and pushing relentlessly for reforms that would help all children, not just those fortunate enough to be born into wealthy circumstances. She is the founder and president of the Network for Public Education, and she has now written a remarkable memoir titled An Education: How I Changed My Mind About Schools and Almost Everything Else. I am beyond pleased to say, Diane, welcome to oped.tv. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be invited. Thank you.
So you've devoted your professional life to the study and improvement of public education. What led you to this topic as an area of study? How did you first become interested in it?
Well, I had a choice back many years ago in the 1960s. I knew that I wanted to write, but I hadn't found what I was going to write about. And as I explain in the book, I worked originally for a small democratic socialist magazine called The New Leader, and the editor of the magazine said, find one thing and make yourself expert in that one thing. I didn't know what that one thing was. But as I was casting about for work, I had an opportunity to do part-time work for the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and they asked me if I would go and visit 3 school districts that were in a rebellion against the Central Board of Education.
Here in New York City.
Here in New York City. And these were 3 heavily minority school districts that were very angry about centralization because they never got any input into what happened in their schools, who was principal, what kinds of programs would be offered, so forth. And so they were, in one of the districts, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and Brooklyn, the superintendent fired a bunch of union teachers, and his decision to do this, which he legally couldn't do because of the contract, led to a 2-month teacher strike. And the schools in New York City were shut down for 2 months because of this strike all around this one district. And I thought I would write an article about it, and I wrote to the New York Times Magazine and was told they weren't interested. And I had never written an article for the New York Times Magazine, but I thought this was so important that I started reading more and more about the New York City schools. Why were they centralized? How could there be a school district with 1 million children? And I spent my days at the New York Historical Society and eventually decided this is not an article, this is a book. And I wrote a book.
You'd never written an article, and now you're going to write a book.
I'd written a few small articles for small publications, and I decided this was too big a story for just an article. So I wrote my first book, and in the process of writing that first book, I got to know the leading scholar of American education, Lawrence Kremen at Teachers College, and he was very encouraging, and although he didn't think I could write a book, but he said, why don't you write a series of essays? And I ended up writing a book. Right. And that book became my dissertation. I earned a doctorate at Columbia University. And my editor of my first book, which was The Great School Wars, A History of New York City Public Education, the editor said that I was a one-book writer. Oh. So that was a challenge, and I continued writing books. And I continued to go deeper and learn as much as I could about education and be an analyst, which is what I was, a historian and very interested in the politics of education, both then and now.
Your work helped me so much when I was writing my book, so I thank you for that. To say that when it comes to education, the past several decades have been tumultuous is an understatement. And the subtitle of your memoir reflects that tumult. How I changed my mind about schools and almost everything else. How would you summarize your initial views about school reform?
Well, I began in my professional life and in life thinking, having gone to segregated schools and lived in a very segregated society, I thought, you know.
You grew up in Texas.
I grew up in Houston, Texas. And I felt that the best answer to all of our problems would be colorblind policy. And that, at the time, seemed like the liberal position to take. Don't put any harm on people because of their race. Don't give any privilege because of race. And I began my writing career with these as my goals, with that as my goal, colorblind policy. Also meritocracy, and I believe the standardized tests were fair because nobody knew who was taking the test. They didn't know the color of the person. That was fair. And so as a writer, I became increasingly conservative without knowing it, because the things that I believed in actually privileged the status quo, but I didn't see it at the time. So for many years, I was seen by other people in the field as being a neoconservative, a conservative, and I began to accept that definition of myself because I stood for high standards, high stakes testing, standardized testing, meritocracy, and these were conservative positions, and I came to accept them.
And at that time, and also big issues were charter schools, what charter schools eventually became, charter schools, vouchers. So you were in support of those things as well.
Well, I worked beginning in 1991, I worked in the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, right, under Lamar Alexander, and I was Assistant Secretary of Education. I support standardized testing and all of those things that everyone else agreed with in the Republican administration. And the idea of charter schools first emerged at that time, which was 1990, 1991. And I thought, gee, that sounds like a great idea. Kids should have an opportunity to go someplace else if their school is failing, and they must have bad teachers. And so I went along with all of these ideas, and I was a supporter of charter schools. I worked for a time for the Manhattan Institute, which is a very conservative think tank in Manhattan. And I went to Albany to testify on behalf of charter schools. So these were ideas that I was very comfortable with. With vouchers, I thought, gee, I had this idea that if kids could go to Catholic school, this would be terrific. I've always been a fan of Catholic schools. I think they have, you know, a moral value that's very important, and they also are more rigorous in their education, usually, than public schools are. What I didn't realize when I believed in vouchers was that vouchers could be used anywhere, not just in Catholic schools. Right. And it was at a seminar actually in Aspen, Colorado, where I met Governor Ann Richards of Texas, and she said if vouchers ever come to pass, most kids will be going to evangelical schools, and you will not be happy at all with what comes out of this. And she was right, but I was still wrong. So that's how I came to be a conservative writer working in a Republican administration. And President Clinton, I kept contact with him, and because I had met him in 1984 before he was president, and he appointed me to the National Testing Board, and I learned a lot more about testing, but I was still very much on the conservative side and supportive of charters and interested in vouchers, with the idea that vouchers might save, the expression of the times, and still is, save poor kids from failing public schools.
Now, those views were unbelievably popular. I mean, politicians in both parties supported most of the things that you're talking about. The mainstream press was on board. You know, many prominent columnists and writers, business leaders certainly were on board with all of the above. Even Ted Kennedy was on board. Why do you think it was so popular, so widely accepted?
Most people believe in standardized testing, and still do. I became disillusioned with standardized testing, and to go into how I became disillusioned, which is the story,
we're going to get to, yeah,
is the story. It's simply the common wisdom, and I think it's important to be skeptical of what is received conventional wisdom. And I think particularly when politicians tell schools how to function, it's almost always wrong because none of them are expert in how to educate kids. And so they end up legislating how teachers should teach and what they should teach. And I've come to believe this is wrong. But at that time, everybody thought, great idea. George W. Bush is elected president through a questionable process, but he's president, and the first thing he comes up with is No Child Left Behind. And No Child Left Behind was filled with bad ideas, but I supported it, and Ted Kennedy supported it, and there were more Democrats that voted for No Child Left Behind than there were Republicans, because Republicans at that time still believed in local control. They don't anymore. But at that time, they were concerned about the federal government taking such a large role in education. And Democrats thought, well, maybe this will produce more money for education, so this is a good thing. So I was in favor of No Child Left Behind, and it was a very messy program.
In 2010, you published a book called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. And it was almost like thunderbolts went off. The book was a sensation, but it was also a repudiation of virtually everything that you had previously advocated in terms of school reform. So talk about the book, how you came to change your mind, and what you came to believe about education and school reform.
Well, this is a big question, because I wrote a whole book about it, and then I go into more detail here in this book.
In your memoir, right.
I had been, after I was in the Bush administration, and after I served on the National Testing Board, which oversees something called NAEP, and every time you see a headline in the paper about American kids' scores have not gone up, they've gone down, or nobody can read in this country. So I had been on that National Testing Board appointed by President Clinton, and I was then, after I left government service, on a number of think tanks, that were quite conservative. Most prominent among them was the one at the Hoover Institution. And the Hoover Institution is like the lodestone of conservative thought in almost every arena. And the education think tank, which was called the Corrett Task Force, was 11 very prominent conservative education intellectuals, all committed to school choice, high-stakes testing, accountability, evaluating teachers by the test scores of their children. School choice was very big and important in that task force. And the more we talked internally, the more we were analyzing why things weren't working. And why was it that No Child Left Behind was having no good effect? It wasn't reaching any of its goals. More and more schools were being labeled failing and were being closed. And teachers were demoralized, and enrollments in teachers in colleges were plummeting. And I began to think whether, are we doing the right thing? And the more we talked about charter schools, the more the very frank discussions was, why are so many of them closing? Why are so many of them failing? And at that time, vouchers were not a big issue, but I think that everybody on the task force had a favorable view of vouchers, but there hadn't been very many of them implemented at that time. And I'm talking about the early 2000s. And I became very skeptical of No Child Left Behind. And I began writing op-ed pieces at that time in the New York Times and elsewhere that No Child Left Behind was not working. And my colleagues all believed it could be fixed. And so we had a debate about whether we should end it or mend it, and I said, end it. It's a disaster. I began calling it the Death Star of American education, because had it gone its merry way, every school in the United States would have been closed by the year 2014.
Every school would be failing.
Right, every school, because the goal was that 100% of kids had to be proficient on the test. And proficient, there's never been a country in the world where 100% of kids are proficient. So that's the formula for closing down old schools and just continuing to open new schools that fail and more new schools that fail. Right. Turmoil and disruption, and that, I guess I was too conservative to fall in love with the idea of turmoil and disruption and failing everybody. because there might be one child in the class that wasn't proficient, or usually a third of them. But the bar was set far too high, because on the national tests, proficient is, to me, it's an A. So if you're saying every child in your class is going to be A, then there would be a hue and cry about why all the grade inflation.
Exactly. There'd be no point in having grades.
Right, exactly. So I began to think, these things I've been saying and advocating for, they're not working. I mean, just look at the results of No Child Left Behind. There was some boost in test scores for a while, and then it leveled out. And there were schools being closed all over the country, and their staffs were being fired, even though they were trying their best. It led to all sorts of outcomes that no one had anticipated, and none of them were good.
And there was an obsession with test scores. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody was just focused like a laser on test scores. Which,
Yes, and what I understood from my experience on the National Testing Board is that the tests are designed as a bell curve, meaning there will always be kids who are failing, there will
Right.
always be kids at the top, and the bell curve, by design, never closes. So it was a conundrum. You're saying everyone's going to be proficient, but the tests are designed so that really only about 35% will have a chance of being proficient, and the others will be arrayed along the rest of the test score. So it was an impossible goal. And as I began being disillusioned and seeing how schools were, everything was test scores, everything was about preparing for the test, and it used to be considered unethical to do test prep. And what was once considered unethical became a necessity. Schools were ordering the test prep material, setting aside time for test prep, and everything was geared toward testing and reading and math. And more schools were eliminating the arts, eliminating recess, eliminating time for anything that wasn't reading and math. And this made school a dreary place when everything depended on the scores. I think it was also deeply discouraging and stigmatizing to the kids who knew that they would never be in the top 10%. I mean,
Right.
the top 10% can't hold 100%. The top 10% holds
It's
10%. Right. So even in the top 30%, it is never going to be 100%. So we created this no-win situation in which it became popular to say, for the politicians to say, our schools are failing. Well, here we are, let's say the most powerful country in the world by militaries and also by culture. I mean, American culture streams around the world, and people want to come here, particularly for our universities. But how could our universities be so great if our schools everywhere are
Right,
failing? How could our country have such a vibrant culture if all of our schools are failing? Who built this great, successful culture? 90% of the people in this country were graduates of public schools. So, I went to public schools, and I guess I just didn't have that attitude that a lot of my friends and colleagues did who spent their entire life in private schools or religious schools.
And so many people were hanging their hats on charter schools. I mean, this was the answer. The public schools were failing, and then they were making these sweeping gestures and sweeping comments about all public schools. I mean, it was absurd. But I'd like to talk about charter schools for a moment. Charter schools became something completely different. The charter schools that we think of now are completely different from the initial idea of what charter schools were supposed to be. So can you talk about that a little bit, about how the idea of charters emerged and what happened to that original vision?
Well, the idea of charter schools was that they would have a measure of independence to experiment with different methods. There was a professor in Massachusetts who first put forward the idea in a little-known publication, but that little-known publication was read by Albert Shanker. And Albert Shanker said,
who was the head of the
American Federation of
Teachers, right?
And Albert Shanker had a very powerful voice, not only because he was head of the AFT, but because the other larger teachers union had, every 2 years, they had a new president. And the AFT president, Al Shanker, was there for many years, and he was a brilliant intellectual and much respected in the business community, also in politics. And he had visited schools in Germany where he was very impressed by innovation, and the innovation might be the same teacher staying with a class for 4 years, 5 years. But he thought things could be different, and that he wanted to see schools, charter schools, whose purpose was to take the kids who were not succeeding in public school, whose purpose was to find and recruit the kids who were bored in school, who didn't show up, they had a lot of absenteeism, or who were sitting in the back of the room with their head on the desk, totally uninterested and unmotivated. And he thought with this new idea of charter schools, teachers could be set free to truly innovate and see if they could find better ways to bring these kids into some sense of excitement about learning.
They would still be public schools.
Yes, and his idea was that the charter schools would all be unionized. They would be part of the public school district. They would have to be approved, first of all, by the other teachers, because he didn't want to create a situation of we're better than you because we're in a charter school and you're not. And they would have a lifespan. They would have a lifespan of 5 years that might be renewed for another 5 years, but they wouldn't be permanent. And they would have to be approved by their local school district. So he saw the charter schools as like the R&D laboratory for public school districts, not competitors, but collaborators. His idea was jettisoned and destroyed almost immediately. The first state that adopted charter schools was Minnesota, and their state law said that nothing about the schools had to be unionized, and it set up charter schools as independent entities that would compete for students with public schools. And it didn't say anything about you have to draw in the kids who are the least motivated. So of course the charter schools began with the practice of seeking out kids who were applying and highly motivated, and in many cases draining public schools of their best students.
Charter schools are ubiquitous now. They're not performing writ large. They're not performing any better than public schools. You know, I think it's fair to say that whole school reform effort from, it's now been several decades, has failed. But anyway, we're now in the second Trump presidency. So in our last 2 or 3 minutes, can you talk a little bit about what's happening to education, public education in America now, and what should we be doing?
Well, what Trump wants to do, and he wanted to do this in his first term, but he's doing it with a vengeance in his second term, is to destroy public schools. He would like to see them replaced entirely with parental choice amongst religious schools, private schools, home schools, schools operated for profit, name it, hang a shingle out and recruit students, but there's no reason to have public schools because why accept the responsibility for that? Consequently, there are now a number of states that have universal voucher programs where every child in the state is eligible for a voucher without regard to family income. And what's happened there is that most of the kids, the majority of kids in every state are coming from private schools. The kids who get the vouchers, I just yesterday saw a report from Arkansas, 88% of the children in Arkansas with a voucher never attended a public school. So they're not saving poor kids from failing school.
Right.
They're simply subsidizing children whose parents can afford to pay for school and we're already paying for school. The same thing is true in Florida and Arizona and every other state that has adopted vouchers. The state is now paying the cost of private and religious school that was previously borne by the family. What should we be doing instead? We should be doing what the founders of the Common School believed, which is to have our public schools be the best in the world, have schools with certified teachers who are knowledgeable, experienced, well prepared to teach whatever subject they're teaching. Make sure that all kids have opportunities to learn history, science, literature, the arts, mathematics, time for play, and the teachers are free to be professionals and not controlled by state legislatures telling them how to teach. I think that our goal should be equity and equality, as it has been for many, many years, and that everything that Trump is doing is to destroy the Department of Education. He has just used the shutdown to virtually close down what remains of the Department of Education, to eliminate the special education services, which are crucial for kids and for schools all over the country, and to do his best to say that education is the family's responsibility and the state's responsibility. It's not the federal government's responsibility. That has to be reversed, and hopefully before long, certainly not in the next 3 years. What the damage he's doing, I hope, will be reversed, because it will set education back by about a century.
So that's all the time we have now. Thank you so much for coming in. This concludes our first interview with Diane Ravitch. Our next program will explore Diane's personal life, its radical changes, and what she learned about the lives of ordinary men, women, and children in America. I'm Bob Herbert. Thanks for watching. See you next time. CUNY TV now has an app. Downloading the CUNY TV app lets you join us anytime from anywhere.